Silence is often mistaken for weakness. In a world that rewards reaction, explanation, defense, and emotional display, silence can look like avoidance, or fear, or surrender. But psychologically, silence can be something else entirely. It can be presence without permission. It can be power without performance. And to a narcissistic psyche, silence is not neutral. It is destabilizing. Because narcissists do not fear confrontation the way most people do. They fear absence. They fear the moment when their emotional gravity no longer pulls you in. They fear the space where control used to exist, and now doesn't. This video explores why narcissists cannot survive silence, through the lens of Jungian psychology, shadow dynamics, and inner authority. Not from a place of revenge, not from superiority, but from understanding what silence actually does to a psyche built on external regulation. Part 1. Narcissism is not confidence, it is dependence. One of the most damaging myths about narcissism is that narcissists are self-sufficient. They are not. At the psychological core of narcissism is dependence on reflection. The narcissistic self does not generate stable inner worth. It must be mirrored, validated, reacted to, feared, or needed in order to feel real. This is why narcissists provoke, why they escalate, why they charm, test, withdraw, reappear. Not because they enjoy chaos, but because chaos produces response. And response is nourishment. From a Jungian perspective, this is the ego trying to survive without connection to the self. As Carl Jung observed, when the ego is cut off from the deeper self, it becomes desperate to anchor itself externally, and silence removes that anchor. Part 2. Why silence feels like erasure. To a regulated nervous system, silence is space. To a narcissistic psyche, silence feels like annihilation. Why? Because narcissists do not experience themselves as whole unless they are being perceived. Your attention doesn't just reassure them. It stabilizes their sense of existence. When you argue, explain, defend, cry, justify, or even hate them, you are still oriented toward them. But silence does something radical. It removes orientation. It says, I am no longer organizing myself around you, and this is not read as maturity. It is read as threat, not consciously, but psychologically. Part 3. Silence collapses the power dynamic. Narcissistic power does not come from strength. It comes from predictability. They learn. What makes you explain? What makes you chase? What makes you apologize? What makes you stay? And over time, they build an internal map of your emotional reflexes. Silence destroys that map. When you stop reacting, they can't provoke. They can't correct. They can't rescue. They can't dominate. Because power requires participation. Silence withdraws participation without aggression. That is why it works. Part 4. Why empaths struggle with silence. Empaths are often deeply uncomfortable with silence, not because they are weak, but because they are attuned. They feel unfinished emotional loops. They sense unresolved energy. They mistake silence for abandonment or cruelty. But here is the crucial distinction. Silence is not punishment. Silence is containment. When an empath stops speaking compulsively, explaining endlessly, or soothing prematurely, they are not withholding love. They are withholding access. And access is the currency narcissists rely on. Part 5. Silence forces the shadow to surface. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is everything the ego cannot tolerate seeing about itself. For narcissists, the shadow contains shame, dependency, emptiness, fear of insignificance, emotional immaturity. Noise keeps the shadow hidden. Drama keeps attention outward. Silence removes distraction. When there is no response, no emotional supply, no engagement, the narcissist is left alone with what they avoid most, themselves. This is why silence often triggers a rage, a smear campaigns, sudden hoovering, emotional escalation, victim narratives. These are not signs of strength. They are signs of collapse pressure. If this kind of calm, psychological depth resonates with you, gently like the video, then tell us in the comments what your thoughts are. Part 6. Why they escalate when you go quiet. Many empaths notice something confusing. The calmer they become, the more erratic the narcissist behaves. This is not coincidence. It is panic. Because silence doesn't just remove validation, it removes regulation. The narcissist's nervous system has been outsourcing stability to you. When that supply disappears, they scramble. They send cryptlistic messages, suddenly become affectionate, accuse you of cruelty, reframe themselves as the victim, spread distorted narratives, all attempts to force engagement. Silence is not what hurts them. What hurts is losing control over your attention. Part 7. Silence is not a strategy, it is a state. Here's the mistake many people make. They perform silence while still emotionally engaged. They don't speak, but they watch. They don't respond, but they wait. They don't explain, but they hope. This is not silence. This is suppression. True silence is internal. It is the moment you no longer need to be understood by someone who refuses to understand. It is when your center of gravity moves back inside you. Narcissists sense the difference immediately, because performative silence still leaks energy. Integrated silence does not. Part 8. Why silence signals inner authority. Inner authority is not dominance. It is self-reference. When you stop explaining your boundaries, defending your feelings, justifying your needs, you are no longer asking for permission to exist. Silence communicates. I trust myself more than I need your validation. This is intolerable to narcissistic dynamics, because they rely on your doubt. If this resonated, share it with someone who feels themselves pulling back, not in bitterness, but in clarity. And subscribe to the Mind Kit. This series is only just unfolding. Part 9. The moment silence changes the power forever. There is a precise psychological moment when silence shifts everything. It is not when you stop talking. It is when you stop waiting. When your silence is no longer a pause, but a departure. At that point, the narcissist feels irrelevant. Their narratives lose traction. Their emotional hooks fail. Their influence evaporates. Not because you won, but because the game no longer exists. Part 10. Silence is how individuation begins. In Jungian terms, this is individuation, the withdrawal of projection, the reclaiming of psychic energy, the return of authority to the self. Silence allows you to hear your intuition again, your nervous system again, your truth again. Noise kept you entangled. Silence sets you apart. Part 11. Why this terrifies narcissists. Because individuation cannot be controlled. They can manipulate emotions. They can distort narratives. They can provoke reactions. But they cannot touch someone who has returned to themselves. Silence is not invisibility. It is unreachability. Part 12. What silence is not. Let's be clear. Silence is not stonewalling, emotional punishment, avoidance, emotional coldness. Silence is emotional sovereignty, self-trust, boundary without argument, presence without performance. That difference matters. Part 13. The final shift. Eventually, something subtle happens. The narcissist stops reacting, not because they healed, but because there is nothing left to pull. And you realize something quietly powerful. You didn't need to convince. You didn't need to expose. You didn't need to prove. You just needed to stop feeding what was feeding on you. Finally, the quiet that sets you free. Silence does not destroy narcissists. It reveals them. And more importantly, it reveals you to yourself. The moment you stop speaking to be heard and start listening to yourself, the dynamic ends, not with drama, not with closure, but with peace. And that is why narcissists can't survive silence. Subscribe to the Mind Kit.